They destroyed a human colony then. 700,000 Earth warships entered their territory. The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the quiet of deep space, which I had grown used to over 20 years of service. This was a different kind of silence, the kind that hits you before your brain understands why, the kind that sits in your chest like cold water. My name is Commander Yara Solano. And when the UEF vessel, unyielding, dropped out of slipspace above New Carthage, I already knew something was wrong. The distress beacon had been looping for 9 hours before we received it. A 9-hour delay meant the nearest responding vessel was us. That alone was enough to make my hands go still on the armrest. Navigation confirmed position. I said, confirmed, Commander. We are in standard orbit above New Carthage, Sector 7 of the Kepler expansion zone. I looked at the main viewport. There was no New Carthage. There was a planet. The shape was correct. The size was correct. And the orbit matched every chart we had, but the surface that should have shown blue coastlines and green farmland and the warm amber glow of city lights on the night side was flat and gray and still smoking in long, slow curls that drifted into the upper atmosphere like the last breath of something enormous. Lieutenant Garrett, I said quietly, tell me what you are seeing. My sensor officer, a young man named Owen Garrett, did not answer right away. His fingers moved across his console, slowly, as if he was hoping the data would change if he touched it gently enough. It did not change, Commander. He said, the surface temperature across 94% of the landmass is consistent with sustained orbital energy discharge. Silicate reformation is already visible across the northern continent. The atmosphere is showing particulate saturation at levels that would be that would be consistent with a full sterilization event. Sterilization, that was the word, not an accident, not a disaster, not a war. A sterilization. Population was 2.3 million, said my first officer, Commander Diane Holt, from the station beside me. Her voice was flat. She was doing what I was doing, keeping herself inside the professional container. Because if you stepped outside it, even for a moment, you would not find your way back. What caused this? I asked. Orbital energy discharge, multiple points of origin, Owen said. Signature analysis is running now. He waited. Console beeped. He read the result once. Then again, Commander, the discharge signature matches Vreth Dominion weapons platforms, specifically the Vreth Keth class heavy orbital strike configuration. Vreth Dominion. I'd encountered Vreth patrol vessels twice in my career. Both times the interaction had been cold and dismissive. The Vreth considered themselves a senior power in this region of the galaxy. They had been traveling between stars for over 600 years before humanity launched its first suborbital flight. They made sure we were aware of that, in the same way that a person of inherited wealth makes sure you are aware of their family name. It was constant and quiet, and it was meant to diminish, but this was not dismissal. This was not even hostility. This was 2.3 million people turned into ash on a cooling plane. Get me a full wreckage scan, I said. I want evidence packages assembled, sensor logs, discharge signatures, atmospheric analysis, everything encrypted and time-stamped. And get me a direct line to command on Sol. The process took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of orbiting a dead world watching the smoke drift, listening to Owen and his team compile numbers into documents that would explain to someone sitting in an office on Earth that 2.3 million of our people were gone, that someone had decided they were a contamination, that someone had removed them when the transmission to Saul was ready. I recorded it myself. I kept my voice steady. I presented the evidence clearly. I gave coordinates, timestamps, and identification markers. I did not editorialize. I did not ask for anything. I simply presented the facts of what had happened above New Carthage, and let the facts speak in the language they chose. Then I waited. The response took 11 minutes. 11 minutes is a long time when you are waiting to hear what your civilization intends to do about 2.3 million of its people. I had expected a chain of acknowledgments. I had expected requests for confirmation, for secondary analysis, for diplomatic consultation. I had been in the UEF long enough to understand that large institutions move slowly, especially when the decision in front of them is large. The response was not large. It was 11 words. All fleets authorization. Omega, all of them moved to staging. Coordinates now. I read it 3 times. Authorization Omega was not a protocol I had ever seen used. It existed in the UEF command manual as a theoretical designation, the kind that military planners put into documents and then quietly hope they will never need to open. It meant full mobilization, not a task force, not a strike group, not a regional fleet. Every ship, every crew, every active commission and reserve commission and mothballed hull that could be refitted and launched. Diane, I said. I read it. She said, get us to staging coordinates. What happened next is difficult to describe because there is no experience in ordinary life that prepares you for it. We moved to the designated coordinates at the edge of the Kepler expansion zone, and we waited again, and then the slip space signatures began to appear. One at first a single vessel drawing into normal space, it's running lights steady in the dark, then 2 more, then 6, then 20, then they were appearing faster than I could count, faster than Owen's sensors could log them individually, and the system had to switch to aggregate tracking because the individual contacts had become a field. I stood up from my command chair. I do not think I was aware that I had done it. I walked to the viewport and I pressed my hand against the glass and I watched the stars disappear. Not literally, but one by one the clean dark spaces between the stars were being filled with hulls, long and gray and running silent, each one carrying a crew, each crew carrying a memory of what New Carthage had looked like on a map before this day and what it would never look like again. 700,000 vessels. I had served 20 years in the UEF. I had never known we had 700,000 vessels. I am not certain that most people in the UEF had known. These were ships that had been built over decades in quiet orbital yards, registered in reserve databases, crewed in rotation, maintained with the patient and unhurried discipline of a civilization that had learned very early in its expansion that the galaxy was not always friendly. A civilization that had learned quietly, that had not broadcast its preparation, that had simply continued year after year, building and training and waiting for a moment it hoped would never come. Moment had come. Commander, Owen said. From behind me, his voice was different. now younger somehow, like the 22 years of professional experience had briefly left him, and he was just a person, looking at something he had never expected to see. Are those all ours? Yes, I said, all of them, all of them. He was quiet for a moment, then, I don't think the Vreth know we had all of them. I turned back from the viewport and walked back to my chair and sat down. The fleet was still assembling around us. It would continue to assemble for another 6 hours. When it was fully formed, it would move as a single body toward Vreth territory, and no force in this region of the galaxy would be capable of stopping it. I opened a channel to my crew. This is Commander Solano, I said. New Carthage is gone. 2.3 million people, families, workers, children, gone because someone decided they were in the way. We are going to make sure that the people who made that decision understand what that choice has cost them. We're going to make sure that every civilization watching this moment understands what it means to destroy a human colony. I closed the channel. Outside the viewport, the fleet continued to arrive. Ship after ship after ship, filling the dark until the dark had no room left. I thought about the 9-hour silence of the distress beacon, the long slow smoke curling off a dead world, the 11-word message from command that had answered it. I thought about 2.3 million people who would never know that every ship in the human fleet was moving tonight. Because of them, set course, I said, all ahead. The first sensor report came in at 300 station time when the Vreth command station Vathras was running at minimal crew capacity, and the strategic operations floor was occupied by a skeleton staff of 7 analysts and 1 very tired flag officer. Admiral Shankarath had not intended to be awake. He was 63 years old, a career officer with 4 decades of service to the Vreth Dominion, and his body had developed strong opinions about sleep that his rank had not been able to fully override. He'd been in his quarters for 40 minutes when the alert chimed. He answered it because that was what he did. In 40 years he had always answered alerts. What is it? He said. Admiral, we are reading anomalous slipspace egress activity at the human frontier, Sector 14, along the Kepler boundary. Shankarath sat up. Define anomalous. Multiple simultaneous exits. We are currently logging 19 separate events in the last 8 minutes. 19 was unusual. Human vessels occasionally crossed the Kepler boundary in small numbers. Survey ships, supply convoys, the occasional patrol. 19 simultaneous exits suggested a military response. The Dominion had executed a sterilization protocol in that sector recently. He had approved the order himself as required by standard territorial management doctrine. 19 ships was a reasonable response, he supposed. Emotional humans were known for emotional responses. It would need to be managed, but it was manageable. Send 2 patrol cruisers to investigate, he said. Standard identification procedure. If they attempt to cross the boundary, issue a formal warning. Yes, Admiral. He lay back down. The second alert came 14 minutes later. Admiral, the patrol cruisers have not responded to our last 3 communication attempts. He sat up again. Last known position. They were approaching the egress zone when contact was lost. We are also reading, Admiral. The sensor reading has changed significantly. We are now logging. There was a pause. We are logging in Estimated 412 separate contacts, and the number is still rising. Shankrath stood up. He did not sit back down again that night. By the time he reached the strategic operations floor, the number had passed 2,000. By the time his full senior staff had assembled, it was past 9,000. The sensor arrays were struggling to process the volume of contacts individually, and the system had flagged a request to switch to aggregate tracking, something designed for detecting asteroid fields and debris clouds, not enemy fleets. He authorized the switch. The aggregate display showed a mass, not a fleet formation, as the Vreth understood fleet formations. Mass, a dense moving concentration of vessels covering an area of space that made the largest Vreth military exercise in history look like a training simulation run with a fraction of the required ships. How many? He asked his chief sensor analyst. A careful woman named Prathais looked at her display for a long moment before answering. The aggregate model is still calibrating, Admiral. Current estimate is. She stopped. The current estimate is between 600,000 and 750,000 vessels. The room was silent. Shankrath had commanded fleets. He had studied every major military engagement in Vreth history and in the recorded histories of a dozen other civilizations. He understood what large numbers meant in the context of space warfare. He understood ratios and force multipliers, and the way that numerical superiority translated into outcomes. He did not have a framework for this number. His mind tried to build one and found that the materials were not available. That estimate is incorrect, said his deputy commander, Admiral Fet Omas, from across the table. The statement was not aggressive, it was hopeful. Our sensors cannot have accurately counted that volume. There must be a calibration issue. Run secondary confirmation. Shen Karath said. They ran it. Then they ran a third check using a completely independent array. The numbers aligned within a margin of 4% between 680,000 and 720,000 human vessels formed up in the Kepler expansion zone and moving as a single coordinated body toward Vreth territory. Are they transmitting any communication? Shen Karath asked. No, Admiral, said his communications officer. No diplomatic signals, no demands, no warnings. Nothing, nothing at all. Nothing. They are moving in complete signal silence. Shen Karath looked at the display. The mass moved steadily, not fast in absolute terms, but steadily with the particular patience of something that does not need to hurry, because hurrying and not hurrying will produce the same outcome. He had seen that kind of movement once before in a nature documentary about predators on a human colony world. A large, slow-moving creature that traveled at an unhurried pace across open ground because nothing in its environment was capable of presenting it with a reason to accelerate. He had watched that documentary years ago as a study in human ecology, filed it away, and never thought of it again. He thought of it now. Convene the High Council, he said. Emergency session within the hour. The emergency session of the Vreth High Council lasted 3 hours, and it accomplished very little beyond the confirmation of facts that everyone present already understood and did not want to accept. The fleet was real. The number was real. Humans had built something in the dark that no intelligence service in the Dominion had detected, and they had built it to a scale that no strategic model in the Dominion had considered possible for a civilization of humanity's age. 1. Council member, Administrator Pelshar, raised the question of humanity's industrial capacity. She had studied human development extensively and had always argued that their expansion was moving at a rate that warranted closer attention. She said this now. Several of her colleagues reminded her that she had been saying it for 11 years and that the Council had consistently assessed the threat as manageable. Nobody argued with her this time. What is their likely target? Asked the High Commander, a large, slow-speaking official named Gret Vor, whose authority exceeded even Shenkareth's in matters of territorial defense. All indicators suggest a direct course for Vathra, Shenkareth said. Our home system, can our frontier defenses delay them? Our frontier defenses, Shenkareth said carefully, were designed for the military threats. We had modeled the threat we are looking at now is outside the parameters of every model we have. Gret Vor looked at the display for a long time. What about our allies? The Shalorith Conclave has defense agreements with us. We have contacted the Conclave, said the foreign liaison, a thin official named Kareth Tees. Their response was sympathetic. They are not intervening. The Kel Consortium, the consortium has offered mediation. Mediation. Gret Vor repeated the word as if tasting it for meaning. Yes, High Commander, they have contacted the human fleet directly, and the human response. Kareth Tees was quiet for a moment. 2 words stand aside. The chamber was silent again. Outside the windows of the Council station, the stars looked the same as they always had, bright, distant, indifferent. Shenkareth had spent 40 years under those same stars, feeling the particular comfort of a senior officer in a senior civilization, the comfort of someone who existed near the top of a hierarchy and who had never seriously needed to consider what lay above the ceiling. He was reconsidering. Now issue a formal offer of reparations, Gret Vor said finally. Resources, territory, whatever they name, whatever they want. High Commander, Shenkareth said. The colony they destroyed, New Carthage, held 2.3 million people. I am aware of the figure. What we can offer them are things. Resources and territory are things. The things that were on New Carthage. He stopped, then continued, cannot be replaced with things. Gret Vor looked at him for a long moment, and the High Commander turned back to the display where 700,000 ships moved through the dark, patient and enormous and silent. Issue the offer anyway, he said quietly, and begin civilian evacuation protocols for Vathris. Shenkareth looked at the display one more time. He had spent 40 years building a career on the certainty that the Vreth Dominion was a power that did not need to fear the civilizations around it. He had operated from that certainty the way you operate from solid ground. You do not test it, you do not question it, you simply stand on it. He was standing on it still, but for the first time in 40 years, he could feel it shifting. My name is Ambassador Dale Moby, and I was not supposed to be here. That is not a complaint, it is simply a fact. When the unyielding staging coordinates were broadcast to the fleet and 700,000 ships began to assemble in the Kepler expansion zone, the command directive that followed included a line I nearly missed because it was buried at the end of a 20-page operational order. Diplomatic representation mandatory per UEF Charter Article 14 Section 3. Article 14 Section 3 required that any major military deployment include an active diplomatic officer. It was a rule written by people who believed that wars should always have a door left open, even when no one wanted to use it. I believe that too. It was the reason I had spent 19 years in the UEF diplomatic corps instead of the military. So there I was, aboard the diplomatic vessel, Steadfast Word, traveling inside the largest military fleet ever assembled in human history, carrying a mandate that everyone around me privately regarded as decorative. I did not take that personally. I had worked in enough difficult rooms to understand that when people are in pain, diplomacy feels like an insult. The crew of every ship in this fleet had known people on New Carthage, friends, family, colleagues, former crewmates who had transferred to colonial duty. 2.3 million connections spread across a civilization, and every single one of them was now a wound. You do not hand a person in that condition set of negotiation protocols and expect gratitude. I understood that. I kept myself quiet and I watched and I tried to understand what I was part of. What I was part of was something that did not have a word in the standard UEF operational vocabulary. It was not a punitive expedition because punitive expeditions are designed to teach a lesson and then return. It was not an invasion because invasions are designed to take and hold. It was not a show of force because a show of force is theater. And there was nothing theatrical about 700,000 ships moving through the dark in complete signal silence. It was a consequence. It was the physical, material consequence of one specific decision made by one specific civilization arriving in the form that decision had earned. On the fourth day of transit, I received the VREF reparations offer. I read it carefully twice. It was extensive. They offered 3 star systems in a region of space adjacent to the Kepler expansion zone, uninhabited, resource-rich, strategically valuable. They offered economic concessions worth decades of trade advantage. They offered a formal, written apology from the High Council to be broadcast on all galactic communication channels. They offered to recognize human colonial rights within a defined expansion token corridor that was significantly larger than anything previously agreed. It was by any objective measure an enormous offer. Under most circumstances, it would have been a serious basis for negotiation. I submitted it to Admiral Kovacs with a covering summary. Admiral Petra Kovacs was the commanding officer of the fleet. She was a small, lean woman in her late 50s who had the particular stillness of someone who had been making difficult decisions for a very long time and had stopped being surprised by how difficult they could get. She read my summary and read the offer itself, then looked up at me. What is their price for New Carthage? She said. Admiral, the offer is designed to compensate for the loss. I know what it is designed to do, she said. I'm asking what price they are offering for New Carthage, not for the territory, not for trade access, for New Carthage, for the people. I held her gaze. There is no mechanism in the offer that addresses that specifically, because there is no mechanism anywhere that addresses it, she said. You cannot price 2.3 million lives. You cannot trade for them. You cannot write an apology long enough to cover them. So my answer to this offer is the same as my answer to any offer. Tell me what They are offering for New Carthage, and when they tell you there is nothing they can offer for New Carthage, then tell them the fleet is still coming. She handed the document back to me and returned to her command display. I sent the response. I kept it professional. I did not use Admiral Kovac's exact words, but the meaning was the same. Whatever you can offer, you cannot offer the thing that matters most. The fleet would continue. 3 days later, the Kel Consortium reached out to me directly. Their lead diplomat was an experienced negotiator named Velshero, whom I had dealt with twice before in trade discussions. Velshero was skilled and reasonable and genuinely alarmed. Ambassador Amobai, Velshero said, the scale of what is approaching Vreth territory is creating significant anxiety throughout this region. Several civilizations have requested assurance that human military intentions are limited to the Dominion. I can provide that assurance, I said. The fleet's objective is specific. We would appreciate formal guarantees. I will draft a formal statement of intent, I said, and submit it to Admiral Kovac for authorization. Kovac's response to the statement of intent was to read it, approve the sections she agreed with, and add a single line at the bottom. Any civilization that provides material support to the Vreth Dominion during this operation will be considered participant in the events of Hakarth. The line was legally imprecise. Diplomatically, it was a closed door. Every civilization that had been considering whether to lend support to the Vreth suddenly had a very clear picture of what that support would cost them. No one provided to the Vreth. The Shalreth Conclave issued a statement expressing concern about the precedent being set. I drafted a careful reply acknowledging their concern and noting that the precedent humanity intended to set was that destroying a human colony would be met with a response proportional to the weight of that decision. Kovacs added one line to my draft. Stand aside. I stopped trying to soften her additions. What I did instead was talk to people, officers, crew members, engineers who had spent their careers maintaining ships they never expected to use all at once. I wanted to understand what this fleet was. Beyond the numbers, I had the figures. I wanted the meaning beneath the figures. What I found was not what I expected to find. I had expected anger. There was anger, but it was not the dominant thing. The dominant thing was something quieter and more durable. It was a sense of responsibility. Every person I spoke to talked about New Carthage not as an injustice done to them personally, but as an injustice done to people who could no longer speak for themselves. There was a weight to that, a weight that made people stand straighter and speak more carefully and work longer shifts without complaining. An engineer named Paul Nkosi, who had been maintaining slipspace drives for 22 years and had the calm, methodical manner of someone who trusts process above all things, said something to me that I have not forgotten. I had a cousin on New Carthage, he said, not dramatically. Just as a fact, she went out there 4 years ago, wanted to be part of something being built from the beginning. She was the kind of person who always wanted to be there at the start. He paused. What I keep thinking is that she was there at the start, and then someone decided that the thing she was part of was a problem and removed it, like it had never mattered, like she had never mattered. He looked at his hands for a moment. I don't know that I have the words for what I feel about That, but I know what I want to be part of right now. I want to be part of the answer. I thought about Paul and Kosi's words for a long time. I had spent my career believing that the highest answer to conflict was always conversation. Talk until you find the shared ground. Talk until the space between positions becomes small enough to cross. Talk until the thing that seemed impossible becomes merely difficult and then manageable and then done. I still believe that, but watching this fleet move through the dark, I started to understand something that my training had never quite framed for me. There are moments when the conversation is already happened, and the outcome of that conversation was New Carthage. There are moments when what follows is not a failure of diplomacy, it is the response that diplomacy's failure made inevitable. The Vreth had made a choice. The choice had a cost. 700,000 ships was the cost. What happened after the cost was paid? That was where I came in. That was the part I needed to be ready for. I began drafting frameworks not for negotiation, because this was not a negotiation, for aftermath, for the shape of what came next. When the fleet had done what it came to do and the galaxy had to figure out how to organize itself around the new reality of what humanity was, I worked through the nights. I drank too much coffee and slept too little and filled document after document with language that I hoped would be useful when it was needed. Ahead of us, the Vreth home system grew closer on the navigation display. 14 hours, then 10, then 6. The fleet moved, patient, enormous, and certain. I kept writing. I have to be honest about what I felt in the hour before we reached Vreth space, not fear. I want to be precise about that because I have told this story enough times to know that people expect fear to be the central thing. It was not. Fear requires uncertainty about outcome, and in that hour there was very little uncertainty about outcome. What I felt was something more complicated, a kind of gravity. The awareness that you are standing at a point in time that will exist in records long after you are gone, and that the decisions made in the next few hours will define what those records say about the kind of people we were. I was Commander Yara Solano. I had brought the unyielding this far. I intended to bring it the rest of the way. Admiral Kovac's operational order was precise and it was specific. We were not here to destroy the Vreth civilization. We were not here to take their worlds or scatter their people. We were here to engage military infrastructure, remove the capacity that had been used against New Carthage, and ensure that the Vreth Dominion understood in the clearest possible terms what the cost of that decision was. No civilian targets, no populated centers, military facilities, shipyards, weapons platforms, command stations, supply depots. If it had an active military function, it was a target. If it did not, it was not. Those were the rules. I had read them 6 times. Vreth home fleet was waiting for us at the edge of their system. 11,240 vessels. I know the exact number because Owen logged every contact as it appeared on sensors, and I read his log afterward. 11,240 ships arranged in a defensive formation that stretched across the approach corridor in a wall that would have been formidable against any force the Vreth had ever faced. Against our fleet, it occupied perhaps 3% of the approach corridor's width. They are powering weapons, Owen said. Shields up, I said. Maintain formation. They are hailing us. What are they saying? Owen listened for a moment. They are ordering us to stop and identify ourselves. They are stating that any further advance will be considered an act of war. I thought about New Carthage. I thought about the 9-hour silence of the distress beacon. I thought about what sterilization protocol meant as a phrase in a military document and what it meant as a fact on the ground of a planet where 2.3 million people had lived. They know who we are. I said, continue advance. They opened fire. I am going to describe this accurately because accuracy matters more than drama when the facts are already dramatic enough. The Vreth home fleet fired everything it had, every weapon at maximum capacity, coordinated across 11,000 vessels in a disciplined and professional barrage that would have been devastating against a fleet of comparable size. Our forward shields absorbed it not easily. I do not want to make it sound effortless because it was not. 12 of our forward vessels reported significant shield stress, and 3 of them had to pull back to secondary positions. The energy discharge from 11,000 Vreth weapon systems was enormous, and our crews responded to it the way well-trained crews respond to enormous things, with focused, rapid problem-solving and no wasted movement. But the shields held, and then we were inside their formation. What happened next is something that military analysts have spent years studying, not because it was complicated, but because it was the clearest possible demonstration of what the difference between 11,000 ships and 700,000 ships actually means in practice. The Vreth had no room to maneuver. They had no angles. They had no flanks and no retreat corridors and no reserve positions, because the reserve positions were already occupied by more of us. Our targeting was precise. We struck warships, weapons platforms, and military communication relays. We did not strike the populated stations in the outer system. We did not strike the orbital habitats. We did not strike anything that did not have a direct military function. The engagement lasted 40 minutes and 17 seconds. Admiral Kovac's voice came over the fleet command channel at the 40-minute mark. Calm and level. Cease active engagement. Hold positions. Wait for their response. We waited. It took 4 minutes. Then the Vreth military communication frequency opened, and the voice of someone senior, I later learned it was Admiral Shengarath himself, came through with the words that every relay station in this region of the galaxy would pick up and forward an archive. Vreth Dominion Command accepts unconditional surrender. We are standing down all remaining military assets. We request immediate cessation of hostilities and the opportunity to open formal discussions regarding the terms of our compliance. The bridge of the unyielding was quiet for a moment. Then Owen looked up from his console and said in a voice that was trying very hard to be professional and not quite getting there, "Commander, we are receiving confirmation of the surrender from Admiral Kovac. The engagement is officially over." "Thank you, Owen," I said. I looked at the viewport. The Vreth home system spread out ahead of us. The planet Vothris was visible now, blue and green, alive. Its cities lit on the night side with the warm glow of a civilization that was still breathing. I had looked at the authorization codes for orbital engagement 4 times during the approach. I had them ready. I had not used them. Something about seeing Vothris intact felt important in a way I could not immediately articulate. Diana peered at my shoulder. How are you doing? She asked quietly. I'm not sure. Yet I said honestly, ask me in a few days. Outside ships were repositioning across the system, establishing the perimeter that would hold while Admiral Kovek's team began the process of receiving the Vreth surrender and establishing the conditions of what came next across every communication relay. In this part of the galaxy, the signal was traveling outward, the sound of Vreth Dominion command saying 2 words that no power in this region had ever expected to hear them say: unconditional surrender. I went back to my chair. I pulled up my operational log and began documenting the engagement with the same careful attention to accuracy that I had always believed mattered. Not for drama, not for glory, but because 20 years from now someone would read this and they would want to know what it was actually like. They would want to know what it felt like to stand at a viewport while the stars were replaced by warships. They would want to know what 11 words from command sounded like when they arrived after 11 minutes of silence above a dead world. I wanted to make sure I told them right. Somewhere in the fleet I knew that Ambassador Amobai was already drafting, preparing the language that would turn what we had done here into something that lasted, something with shape and structure, something that the galaxy could use to organize itself around the fact that had just become permanent. We were not what anyone had thought we were. We had never been what anyone had thought we were. We had simply been patient. I thought about Paul and Kosie's cousin. I thought about her wanting to be there at the start of something. She had been. She and 2.3 million others had been there at the start of the most significant shift in galactic power in 300 years. They had not chosen to be. They had not been given the chance to choose. I hoped that what we had done here was worthy of that. I was not certain. I do not think certainty is the right response to something this large. I closed my log. I looked at Vothris, still glowing in the viewport. What happens now? Owen asked from his station. Now, I said, we let the diplomats work. 6 weeks after the surrender, I stood in a room that did not exist anywhere in the UEF operational planning documents. It was a formal reception hall in the administrative center of Vothris, designed for large official gatherings. All high ceilings and carefully arranged lighting and the particular quality of silence that very serious rooms acquire. Over time, I was the first human being to enter it. That fact had taken considerable negotiation to achieve, because Vreth protocol, under normal circumstances, would have required months of procedural groundwork before any formal meeting could be convened in a space like this. Circumstances were not normal. My name is Ambassador Dale Amobai, and this was the moment I had been preparing for since the night I boarded the Steadfast Word and watched 700,000 ships begin to move. The hall was arranged for a formal session of the newly convened Galactic Accountability Review, a body that had not existed 8 weeks ago and that I had spent most of those 6 weeks arguing into existence. On one side of the long table sat representatives of the Vreth Dominion High Council. On the other side sat representatives of 12 other civilizations, observers, witnesses, the first participants in a process that humanity intended to make permanent. At the head of the table there was one empty chair. That chair was mine. I Walked to it. I sat down. I looked at the faces across the table. The Vreth officials, some of whom I had studied in briefing documents for years, none of whom I had ever expected to sit across from in a room like this under conditions like these. Good morning, I said. Let us begin. The terms that Unity had put forward were not what anyone had expected. In the weeks between the engagement at Vothras and this meeting, there had been significant speculation across the galactic community about what humanity intended to do with the Vreth Dominion. The assumptions ranged across a wide spectrum: annexation of Vreth territory, permanent military occupation, dismantling of Vreth governance structures, reparations so severe they would set Vreth development back by generations. What humanity put forward was none of those things. The first term was a war crimes tribunal to be administered jointly by a panel, including human representatives, Vreth representatives, and 3 neutral civilizations agreed upon by all parties. The tribunal would examine the decision to execute the sterilization protocol on New Carthage, identify the individuals responsible at every level of the chain of command, and determine appropriate accountability measures. This was non-negotiable. Every individual who had participated in the decision, from the officers who had carried it out to the council members who had authorized it, would be named, recorded, and held accountable in front of the galactic community. The second term was reconstruction support. The Vreth Dominion would contribute resources, labor, and technical capacity toward the establishment of a new human colony in the Kepler expansion zone, not in the location of New Carthage. That world was gone, but nearby, a new beginning built, in part by the hands of the people whose civilization had ended the previous one. This was not punitive, it was restorative. The distinction mattered to me enormously, and I had argued it into the document over 3 days of internal debate within the UEF policy team. The third term was the establishment of the Galactic Accountability Review as a permanent body with defined authority to investigate claims of civilizational harm by any member species against any other. The Vreth Dominion would be founding members, along with humanity, and whatever other civilizations chose to join. The body would have investigators, a formal evidence standard, and the authority to refer findings to member militaries for enforcement. That last part was the part that made the other civilizations watching this process pay very close attention. The Vreth chief negotiator was a careful, formal individual named Council Speaker Lyrith Voss. She had been in the role for only 3 weeks. Her predecessor had resigned immediately after the surrender. She read through the terms with a focused attention of someone who had been expecting something much worse and was trying to understand whether the thing in front of her was actually as different as it appeared. These terms, she said finally, do not seek territorial control. No, I said. They do not seek economic dominance. No, they seek accountability. She said the word carefully, as if it were a structure she was testing the load-bearing capacity of. Yes, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then why? I had thought about how to answer that question because I had known it would be asked. I had written several different versions of the answer in my drafts over the past 6 weeks, and I had discarded all of them except one because the Vreth Dominion executed a sterilization Protocol on New Carthage, I said. You did it under the doctrine of territorial contamination, which your civilization has applied to 41 other species over 300 years. In every previous case, the civilization affected was not capable of responding in a way that required you to reconsider the doctrine. We are capable of responding in what we want more than territory or economic advantage is. For the doctrine to end, not just for us, for everyone. Lirith Voss looked at me for a long time. You are asking us to accept consequences, she said, and then you are asking us to help build the system that imposes those consequences on others. I am asking you to be part of the reason that what happened to New Carthage does not happen to anyone else. I said, yes. The session lasted 9 hours. There were disagreements, some of them sharp. The Vreth objected to the scope of the tribunal's investigative authority. We narrowed it slightly in exchange for a broader commitment on reconstruction support. The neutral civilization representatives raised concerns about the enforcement mechanism. In the Accountability Review Charter, we agreed to a phased implementation structure that gave all parties more time to develop their participation frameworks. At the end of 9 hours, Council Speaker Lirith Voss signed the agreement outside the hall. On the steps of the administrative center, I found Commander Yara Solano waiting. She had arrived on Vothras 2 days earlier with a small delegation from the Unyielding. She was not here in an official capacity. She had simply wanted to see the place, to walk on the ground of a world that was still intact and understand what that meant in the context of what her fleet had done. She was standing in the Vathras afternoon light, looking up at the sky. It was blue, slightly different from Earth's blue, a cooler tone, more violet at the edges, but it was a sky, a whole unbroken sky above a whole unbroken world. How did it go? She said when she heard me approach. Signed, I said. She nodded slowly. Good. We stood in silence for a moment. Somewhere in the city below us, ordinary Vreth life was continuing. People were working, traveling, eating, talking. The enormous machinery of daily existence that continues regardless of what the powerful are doing. 2.3 million of those same ordinary lives on New Carthage had stopped. They had stopped because of a document, a doctrine, a decision made in a room like the one I had just come from. I looked at the glass. Authorization 3 times, Solano said. I already knew this. She had written it in her operational log, which she had submitted to command without removing that detail. I know, I said. I wanted you to know why I didn't use it. She said, I think I know that too. I said, maybe, she said, but I want to say it anyway. She looked at the sky. Again, the Vreth killed 2.3 million people because they had a doctrine that said those people were a problem. The doctrine was their answer to a question about how to handle things that interfered with their plans. And I had the authorization to answer their doctrine with our own version of the same doctrine. Overwhelming force, no accountability, no survivors, just end the problem. She was quiet for a moment. But if I had done that, she continued, then what we would have built here in this system would be exactly what they built above New Carthage, a demonstration that power is the only answer, that the only thing that determines who gets to exist is whether someone stronger decides they're allowed to. She paused. I don't want to live in That galaxy, I don't want my crew to live in it. I don't want the people on New Carthage, the ones who didn't survive, to have been ended. In order to establish that, I thought about what she had said. I thought about how long I had spent writing frameworks and arguments in careful language, trying to find words that carried the same meaning she had just put into plain sentences while standing on the steps of a building in a city on a world that was still alive because of a decision she had made. The galaxy is watching what we do next, I said. I know, she said. That's why I needed you here. We went back inside. In the weeks that followed, the Galactic Accountability Review began its formal operations. 14 civilizations joined in the first enrollment period, some out of genuine principle, some out of the practical calculation that being inside a structure was better than being outside one that humanity was building. The War Crimes Tribunal convened and began its work, naming names and examining records with the patient thoroughness that real accountability requires. The Vreth participated not enthusiastically. There is a particular difficulty in participating in the examination of your own worst decisions. But they participated. Liereth Vosh showed up to every session. She did not always agree with the findings, but she showed up. The reconstruction project for the new colony in the Kepler zone began with a survey team of 40 humans, and at humanity's specific request, 8 Vreth engineers who volunteered to assist with the technical assessment. The volunteering had not been easy. It had required Liereth Vosh to make a very direct appeal to the engineering community, and the response had been smaller than she had hoped, but 8 had come. 8 Vreth engineers standing on human colonial soil, helping to plan the beginning of something new. Was not a solution to New Carthage. Nothing was a solution to New Carthage. 2.3 million people were gone, and they would remain gone, and no agreement or tribunal or reconstruction project would change that. But it was a direction that pointed somewhere other than the direction the galaxy had been pointing in for 300 years of Vreth sterilization protocols. I worked out of an office in the administrative center for the first 3 months of the review's operations. My window looked out over a wide public space where Vreth citizens went about their lives. I watched them often, usually in the early morning, before the day's sessions began. They were not so different in their daily movements from the people I had grown up watching in Nairobi, people moving with purpose, with routine, with the ordinary weight of ordinary things to do. Those were the people the fleet had not touched. In a communication to command, I wrote the following: the greatest argument for what we chose not to do in this system is standing outside my window every morning. Civilization is not its government's worst decision. It is also all of the people who did not make that decision, but who must live with its consequences. What we have built here gives those people a chance to build something different. That is not mercy for the government. It is a chance for everyone else. Command acknowledged the communication and said they would include it in the official record. On the last day of my 3rd month on Vathris, I received a message from Paul Nkosi. He had gone back to his regular posting. His engineering rotation had ended, and he had returned to the maintenance depot at Kepler Station 7, where he spent his days in the same calm, methodical way he had always spent his days. He said the Depot felt quieter than before. He thought that was probably just him. His message was short. He said he had read about the accountability review and the reconstruction project in the Fleet News. Summary. He said he thought his cousin would have been glad about the reconstruction. She had always liked beginnings. He asked if I thought the new colony would need engineers. I wrote back and said that every new colony needed engineers, and that if he put his name in for consideration, I would personally know his application. He replied with one word, good. I put his name in. Fleet continued to stand down over the following weeks, with vessels returning to their home postings in a steady, organized withdrawal that the galactic community watched with great attention. 700,000 ships had arrived. 700,000 ships were leaving. The watching civilizations had been running calculations on what humanity's fleet meant for the regional balance of power, and those calculations were going to produce the same result, regardless of how many times they were run. Everything was different now, not because of the fleet exactly. The fleet was a fact like gravity is a fact. It had existed before anyone in the Vreth Dominion had decided to execute the sterilization protocol on New Carthage. The fact of it had simply been unknown. What was different was the knowledge that humanity had been patient and quiet and building for a very long time, and that the galaxy had mistaken that patience for weakness. The knowledge that humanity, when it moved with a completeness and a purpose that no existing model had anticipated. And the knowledge, perhaps the most important knowledge, that when humanity had the choice to end in the simplest way available, humanity had chosen instead to end the doctrine. Not every civilization drew the right lesson from that. Some drew the lesson that humanity was simply displaying more sophisticated form of dominance, that the accountability review was a tool for extending human influence under the cover of principled language. Those civilizations were not wrong that the review extended human influence, but they were wrong about the cover. There was no cover. The language was the point. The structure was the point. Building something that would still be functioning and functional and fair long after the memory of the fleet faded into history. That was the point. I believed that then. I believe it now. On the morning of my departure from Vathras, I walked through the public space outside the administrative center one more time. The Vreth citizens were there as they always were, moving through their mourning with the calm of a people who had made a terrible mistake, absorbed its consequences, and were now slowly and not without difficulty trying to do something with what remained. A young Vreth, maybe 12 or 13 years old by my estimate of their developmental stages, stopped and looked at me. Humans were not common on Vathras yet. I was clearly identifiable as human by my build and coloring, and the child looked at me with the open curiosity of someone who has seen pictures but not the real thing. I looked back. I nodded. The child nodded back, then turned and continued walking, carrying something under one arm that might have been a book or a tool or a lunch. I thought, that child did not make the decision to destroy New Carthage. That child will grow up in the world that the decision created. What that world looks like, whether it is a world that learns from what happened or a world that simply fears repeating it, depends on what we build now and how well we build it, and whether we have the patience to keep building long after the fleet has gone. Home and the crisis has faded from the daily news cycle. Patience is something humans are good at. I had watched 700,000 ships prove it. I walked to my transport and I went to work.